So let's take a few moments to review everything that we learned in this section of the course. This section was focused on various CSS approaches in React, and we started with perhaps the most traditional approach, which was declaring a regular CSS file with a .css extension and then importing that file into a React component. We were then able to access all of the styles and classes from the CSS file and simply pass them to the class name attribute of any given JSX element. But the problem with this approach, as we saw, was that the CSS styles were not scoped or limited to that component. Once we imported the CSS file into any component file that was used in our project, those CSS styles became global, which means they had the potential to apply to other elements or other components in case those components used, for example, a matching class name. Or even if we had a style, for example, for a general element selector like an H1. If we declared an H1 in any other file, the CSS styles from another file had the potential to impact that look and feel. And that breaks the spirit of React because a component is supposed to be an independent, isolated chunk of code. So we don't want to create pollution where the effects we have in one file create effects elsewhere, right, in other areas of the code base. And we talked about different solutions to this problem. So we began with inline styles, which are generally not recommended, but they do exist. And I wanted to cover the differences between the style attribute in regular HTML versus in JSX. In regular HTML, we pass a string with the CSS properties that we want to apply to that element. But when we use the style attribute in JSX, we have to pass a JavaScript object instead, where the properties are the CSS properties and the values are the actual values for that CSS attribute. So that syntax is a little bit interesting because we first need the curly braces to provide that JSX interpolation, that JavaScript expression that JSX will evaluate. And then we need another pair of curly braces for the declaration of the JavaScript object itself. We also saw that when we were declaring those CSS attributes, we needed to use a camel case for the property names. So for example, background color in regular CSS files is written as background-color, but in our style object, we defined it as background color with no hyphen and a capital C. So that is something you have to watch out for when declaring inline styles. The next approach we talked about was CSS modules. A CSS module ends with a .module.css extension, and the idea behind these files is that they prevent pollution. So they are meant to be imported into every component where they will be used. And when we import a CSS module file, we get access to a JavaScript object where the properties are the defined CSS class names. And we simply reference the properties on that styles object, and we provide those classes to our class name attribute. So it's very similar to the traditional CSS approach, but this time around, we're using curly braces and referencing a class name on an object rather than simply writing it in as a string. And this approach prevents pollution because the CSS module style object will only be available in the component that it is imported within and not elsewhere in our code base. So this is very traditional, very much like regular CSS, except without the pollution. So this is a common approach to CSS in React. Another thing we explored was the idea of CSS in JS. And there are many libraries that support this paradigm, but we tried out perhaps the most popular one, which is styled components. The way this NPM library works is we import its default export, which is an object with methods, and each method is representing an HTML element, and it will return a React component with that HTML element with the given styles that we provide. And those CSS styles will be scoped, which means they will be limited to that actual component, that element that we are creating. So we use a special syntax called tagged template literals. That's where we put that tick syntax to create a multi-line string. And then we simply write our CSS styles within that string. And again, we get back a regular React component and we simply render it inline just like any other React component, but it automatically has those styles. So the reason this approach is called CSS in JS is because we write our full CSS declarations within a regular JavaScript file within our regular component file. So we see our actual code, our component code, directly alongside our CSS styles. So everything lives within one file. Some developers like that, some developers don't like that. It's really a matter of personal preference, but this is another option in the CSS ecosystem. Finally, we moved on to Tailwind CSS. Tailwind, of course, is an NPM library consisting of thousands of small utility classes. Each one of them does a single thing, like perhaps add margin or make a box a flex box, etc. And after we set up Tailwind in our project, we simply pass whatever classes we want to our class name attribute, just like they were our own. So whenever you add Tailwind to a project, you're typically not going to have any CSS files of your own because you're simply going to use the existing classes in this library. The analogy I gave to you is imagine another developer wrote thousands of classes for you, and that is the complete palette that you are welcome to work with in your project. That's how Tailwind works. We never have to worry about defining our CSS class names or having separate files. We just have all of these small classes and we combine them to style our actual elements. So as we know, Tailwind has classes for background color, for text color, margin, padding. We didn't explore some of its advanced features, but it also has support for pseudo classes like hover. It has support for animations, transitions, gradients. It's all just a combination of classes that we write in line that are immediately available to us. And as we saw, there are ways to customize Tailwind. So for example, if your brand has custom colors or custom fonts, we don't just need to work with whatever Tailwind gives us. We can customize the Tailwind config.js file, and that allows Tailwind to generate additional utility classes for our project. So in our example, we actually defined two colors, which we called React Black and React Blue, and Tailwind generated various color-related CSS classes for them, such as background color and text color. And those CSS classes will have the same naming conventions as Tailwind's built-in classes. So it's super convenient because eventually you just can't even tell whether the class is coming from Tailwind or yourself. But the same principle applies. We just write a whole bunch of classes in line and we enable Tailwind to generate additional classes for us by customizing the Tailwind config file. As I mentioned, Tailwind is my personal favorite. It's my approach today if I'm building a React project from scratch, but all of these options are popular in the wild, in the React ecosystem as it stands. So play around and see which one you enjoy the most. All right, that's all there is to cover in this review. So I will see you in the next section of the course.